You're there.
Sweet.
I'm here.
All right. So, do
No-
we start with
number
an introduction or do we talk about
No, we should start with an introduction.
Okay.
Number 5, episode 5.
episode 5? Wow, man. We're-
Cranking them away.
Welcome to Talking in the Chasm, a compassionate, controversial conversation between best friends. Holy man.
And the atheist. The atheist.
I'm the atheist, man. There's just one of us. Everybody else is a pretender. But, yeah.
And your name is Felix.
My name is Felix.
And I'm Matthew.
And Matthew. All right, so what are we talking about today?
Today, we wanted to look at economic materialism. We talked about metaphysical materialism.
Right.
But consumerism, economics, money, how it runs the world and controls things.
Right.
So where should we start? You have a starting point?
I don't. I was thinking of big corporations and
Sure.
stuff. You know,
Let's do it.
I mean, I was thinking about this the other day. When Google started, you know, they had the slogan was "Don't be evil."
Mm-hmm.
You know, and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then they become this huge corporation, and then it gets so big that it's kind of beyond the control of just a few people. It becomes a board and all this stuff, and then at some point they're talking to China and saying, okay, well, China will let us do Google there as long as we edit out the Tiananmen Square thing, and we have to lie about history, and then when that's evil.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, at some point you're going to get to this gray area. And my thought was, does the size of the company sort of make evil a prerequisite? You know what I mean? Like after you get so big,
Yeah.
does it? But my daughter Magali works at Starbucks, and that's a huge company. But they're very concerned about mental health, and they're concerned about saving the planet, and they locally source what they can, and they fair trade as much as they. You know, it just seems like a good company. They pay for education for their employees. They can all go to college for free at the University of Arizona. They have a program where they help you buy a car. They pay for an Uber if it's after dark. I mean, you know, they seem like a really good company, and yet they're huge.
Mm-hmm.
So what are they doing, right?
I have a friend who's who runs a fund, a mutual. I don't know if it's a mutual fund, but some kind of fund, and they're very large. But in their case, they've restricted their fund, and there's a bunch of them. There's just one of them. It's a socially responsible fund, but there's no. They do medical, but not abortion, not cosmetic. They don't do munitions or weapons. They don't do alcohol or tobacco. And it's things that people don't often think about. Like, who cares about tobacco anymore? What does that matter? But it actually does quite a bit. Like the emerging markets for tobacco, it's not in America. It's children in Indonesia.
Right.
And so these are very exploitive companies, and it's in everybody's. Investing is a huge part, I think, to this whole thing. Not for you and I. I don't have a big portfolio. I don't know if you do.
I went ahead and deleted the stocks app on my phone. It just made me feel bad, like I'm not responsible.
Yeah. But for people who do, I think you just throw your money in a hole, and it's someone else's job to make it grow. And it is worth being mindful that, you know, one of the principles, like it or not, about a capitalist economy is that your dollars do equate some kind of endorsement. Like where you spend your money
Right. is
perpetuating something. And there are times when I think it makes more or less sense to be mindful of that. When I was teaching my children, we spent a time dealing with child labor. And we looked a little bit at the history of American child labor, but it's still very common in other parts of the world. You have children being chained to looms in Pakistan, and
Right.
horrible, atrocious things. Children working in mines and in coffee plantations and cocoa plantations. And we began to think, well, how could we be more responsible with our money? What could we do to promote good instead of tacitly endorse evil?
Right.
So we did a thought experiment. We actually spent a year trying not to buy anything that wasn't fair traded or American. Not that not as a nationalist thing. I just knew if it's an American
Local,
company,
yeah.
they're not using child labor. So we did that for a year, and it's surprisingly hard to find a dish soap that's not made in China, that you don't know where the sourcing is from.
Right.
But one of the outcomes of that is that we began to make some decisions about real value. How long would it take me to make this garment? How long would it take if I was to sit down with yarn and make socks? How long would that take me, even if I had a setup to do it? And thinking about my commodities in the terms of real value. Because if you can buy a pack of socks at Walmart, 12 pairs of socks for $3, they don't really cost $3. Somebody's paying for what those really cost somewhere else in the supply chain.
Right.
Markets of scale can only do so much. They're impressive, but they can only do so much.
Well, I thought about that, actually. I thought about because a Primark or something opened up and everything is so cheap, and I'm like, how can it be?
Yeah.
And when I think about a shirt, right, like, you can buy a shirt for like $15, but can you really make a shirt for $15 at retail? I mean, is that even really possible?
So think about
without some sort of somewhere along the line cutting some corner, without there being some labor law that's being overlooked, or some 24-hour work,
or some Taiwanese factory.
Right, and the problem now is that's what people expect to pay for a shirt. It's $15.
Yeah, that's right.
So even though a shirt should cost $50, we're not willing to pay that, right?
Well, and what it required when we began, it's so easy to get away from. So I don't consider myself having saintly virtue in regards to my consumerism, but it's something that I think about from time to time. And what you have to do if you want to engage with the world in that way is you have to say, I'd rather have 3 pairs of socks that I know are moral or equitable,
right.
and not have 50 pairs of socks in my drawer.
Right.
And it's helpful for a lot. It's not just helpful for those unseen faces in supply chains. It's also helpful for, I think, us as individuals, especially as Americans, to reevaluate, like, is it sensible to have 50 pairs of socks in a drawer? Like, is that really where we should be? I mean, you live in a very small space, so you make ththose kinds of decisions all the time. Like, this has to fit in the space.
I'm not a full-on minimalist, but I definitely live that way. And I read the, KonMari thing, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Every object, I'm like, wow, does this spark joy? Is this something that I use and want?
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many things you have that you don't use or want.
Yeah.
Especially clothing. I read that book, and then I cut out, I think, 60% of my clothes.
Is that right?
I wear this shirt a couple times a year. Somebody else is going to wear it every day. I don't need this.
Yeah.
So the only problem with that sort of line of thinking about researching money, where it goes, and how when you buy a shirt, is this made ethically? Is that's only once removed. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you don't know if I buy a product from this company that the profits don't get into a mutual fund that goes to the, it's like you can't really get away with it.
Yeah.
And also, like, I remember at one point we stopped ordering Domino's pizza, and I don't remember. I think it might have been because they were
Trump supporters,
pro-choice or something like, or pro-life or something like that. because you dirty pro-lifers, yeah. No, but it was some political reason, you know, and I was like, okay, well, we won't order donuts, that's fine. But then it occurred to me, I don't know about the Coke I just drank. I don't know about, you know, where this beef comes from. It's like, if I researched every single thing that I purchased, that's all I would ever do with my time, right? And at some point, you're going to come down to, it's just really good pizza, and I just, you know, and that maybe that's unethical to sort of think in that way, but you can't research, and even if you did, that's only one step. You can't go, you know, follow the money from where it is. I mean, you know, you can vote against practices that you know, and you can research, and you can say, I don't think you can buy a shirt for $15, so therefore I will not buy a shirt for $15 retail anymore.
I think that there's you're right that it's a very, very tangled web, and we see the same thing in Christian circles. Like we're going to use Sam's Club instead of Costco because Costco's pro-choice and they lobby for LGBT or whatever the case may be. It happens on both sides of the political aisle, and I'm disinclined towards that kind of rationale. I mean, I suppose that there could be some cases that would be so egregious that I would feel like some entities that were so immoral that I didn't want to patronize them. But it would be a really extreme case because, and this is what I say every time a Christian boycott comes up, whether it's Disney or Costco or whoever it is that if I was judging corporations by my ethical standards, I would live in a mud hut in the woods somewhere. I wouldn't own anything, and so I don't have expectations. And there's actually a Christian rationale for that. There's a passage in this one of Paul's letters to the churches, and he says, "We judge those within in the church. God judges those without. Otherwise, you'd have to come out of the world." So what he's saying is that for us, we hold each other to the standards of the Christian worldview. People that are not a part of the church, that's not our business. We don't have to expect that everyone around us is beholden to our particular views. So I don't have to have any I don't have to have any qualms about if this company is moral, because it's almost like we assume the Citizens United decision that these entities are kind of people, like that they're a personality instead of a business with 1,000 million different moving parts.
Yeah, I want to talk about the Ford Motor Company briefly, but it's interesting that you bring that up because in talking about this thing I want to talk about in a second, Irene said, my daughter, if we're going to treat companies as people, we should also prosecute them as people, right? But we don't do that. I mean, you know, we don't hold them to laws. Mm-hmm. So let me just talk about the Ford, because when I was thinking about evil in corporations, Lee Iacocca died recently. And everybody was like, oh my God, such a hero, this amazing businessman. And I just see him as this just horrible, horrible human being. And there's a few examples, but the one that I want to talk about is the Ford Pinto.
Oh, yeah.
So the VW Beetle was the most popular selling car in America, and Ford didn't have a tiny, what they called subcompact car, right? Yeah. So Lee Iacocca's like, okay, we need a subcompact car, and here's the deal. It's going to cost less than $2,000, and it's going to weigh less than 2,000 pounds, period.
No matter what.
And we're going to do this in 24 months. And usually it takes 48 months or 56 months or something from design to thing. But once you start the metal stamping process, there's no going back, without...
The die is cast.
Yeah, literally, yes. So, although that's a different analogy, but yes, the die is cast. And the safety experts, they were safety testing as they were designing it, right? And the safety people realized that the gas tank was too close to the bumper, and every time there was a hit of more than 15 miles an hour, it would puncture the gas
gas tank.
And much faster than that, it ends up spraying gas everywhere, and it rolls and it sparks, and there's these fiery explosions. And so they did a test of I think 40 crash tests, and 38 of them resulted in a fire. So 2 of them that didn't. One of them was when they used the Impala gas tank, which is in the center. It's really great. And then the other one was when they used this piece of plastic that they put in between the bumper and the thing. So they went up to Lee Iacocca and they said, here's the, we could use the Impala.
Here's the solution.
Yeah, we can use this Impala gas tank. And he said that will take away trunk space. And one of the engineers is like, yeah, you could only put 1 set of golf clubs in the trunk, so we can't have that. And then the piece of plastic cost $1 and it weighed 1 pound. And Lee Iacocca was like, that is something we don't need. Safety doesn't sell, was his words, right? So everything that these engineers did, Iacocca was like, not happening. So they knew that this product wasn't safe. But, they did what they could, but there was nothing that they could do, right? It comes down to this man who, this decision. And they called it Lee's car. I mean, it wasn't like, there was he really didn't have anything to do with it. He spearheaded this Pinto thing, right?
Supervision.
And so they put out the Ford Pinto, and people start dying in horrible ways, burning to death alive in their cars and being horribly disfigured. And they're not totally sure of the death toll, but they said something like 300 people died in this car that could have completely been avoided using this $1 piece of plastic, but those 300 people died. And that's evil, right? But what's really evil is the next thing that happened, and that is they went to Lee Iacocca and they said, hundreds of people are dying, we have to recall this car. And so he sat down with a bunch of number crunchers, and they decided how much would it cost to recall the cars versus how much would it cost to
pay the lawsuits,
to pay out insurance claims and lawsuits, right? And in order to do that, they had to put a value on human life, and the value was $200,700. That was what the value was, right?
That was going to be their settlement figure.
Right. So they decided it's just cheaper not to recall the cars. So they didn't recall the cars.
Let them die.
And I can guarantee you that Lee Iacocca's daughter didn't drive a Pinto.
Yeah.
And that just...
I did. I had one in high school.
My mother had one. She drove me to school every day.
Yeah.
I mean, that, and that this man is celebrated after he dies. It blows my mind.
Mine caught on fire?
Did it?
It wasn't an accident. People flipped it over and lit it on fire, but it did die a fiery death.
Because when it turned over, that was another thing. Often when it got hit, it also flipped over. And the way that it got hit, you couldn't write this nightmare, but the way that it got hit was such that the doors wouldn't open. So, anyway, so this company then was responsible for the death of hundreds of people because of a decision that they made, knowing it would kill people. They knew people are going to die, right? So, but we're going to make the decision anyway. And yet, they're still around. They didn't go to prison for the rest of their lives, right? The company itself wasn't damaged, except that the joke was sort of on them in the end because they ended up paying $40 million for each lawsuit. And, the courts decided, okay, we're going to make an example of this. And it turned out human life was worth more than $200,000. But still...
Still not enough.
Right. People... I mean, the moral thing, I mean, who in the world would say, okay, we don't want one more person to die. We're going to stop production right now.
Yeah.
Or, obviously before, it's like, $1? It's going to be a pound heavier? Okay. It's going to cost $1 more. So maybe the VW Beetle costs $2,070, and then we're going to cost $2,075. It's like, well, then people are going to buy the Beetle. So, people don't know that they're buying a death trap.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that is like pure evil. And those decisions are made all the time. Is it more economically feasible to kill people and pay claims than it would be to recall a product and look bad and save people's lives?
So do you think that's a design feature of capitalism as an economic structure? And what I mean by that is let's do another thought experiment. Let's talk about other industries. So Philip Morris would be a perfect correlation to that. They knew people were going to die from cigarettes, and they didn't put out the warnings, and they didn't want people to know, and they hid research
And
talking about
there's
how bad it
then
was.
there's question about whether they purposely
Made them
put
worse
nicotine
for
in there,
addiction.
yeah.
But what about the alcohol industry? And I'm not a prohibitionist. I don't believe in prohibition
Right.
laws. I don't think they work well. But if you're running Anheuser-Busch or the local craft brewery, you know that whatever percentage of traffic accidents in your area are going to come from your product.
Right.
Are those people as morally culpable as Lee Iacocca for making his Pintos?
Right. There's a huge difference. Okay, one is for the beer. You are creating a product that people enjoy and that people use, and that the majority of people use in a responsible way. If people are irresponsible, that you can't control people from drinking too much beer, right? Lee Iacocca was presented with physical evidence that people will die.
Yeah.
Without fixing these safety issues, people will die. And then they did die, hundreds of people. And then they said, we got to stop this madness. And he said, no.
Yeah.
So that is an actual decision to kill people.
Yeah.
You know, whereas the craft beer person, I mean, I think a more sort of complex moral question would be, okay, you're going to make nicotine in the cigarettes to make them more addictive. Is that even bad? I mean, when you're making chocolate milk, you make it as delicious as you can make it, knowing that people are going to get diabetes and die. I mean, some people are going to drink too much and they're going to die because of the sugar intake. You know, the idea of making any product is to make it so good that people can't live without it, right? I mean, that's the goal.
Yeah.
So do you fault them for that? I mean, you know, so do some people enjoy cigarettes and don't die? You know, I mean, here's something that this is a tough one because there's evidence that it leads directly to lung cancer. Absolutely, it's causation, not correlation. It is absolutely causation.
So maybe openness and transparency about what you're getting is as close as you can get to morality in regards to that, whether you're talking about nutritional information or calorie or ingredients or whatever, that there should be full disclosure. And I think our society's done fairly well at that.
We're going in that direction.
Yeah.
I mean, what sucks is that the government is forcing companies to do that.
But let me ask you this, just to play with the idea. So does the craft beer rationale apply to ammunition and gun manufacture?
Well,
because they're making something that's going to be supposed to be used in a responsible way, and is it not their fault if people use them wrongly?
Right. To me, I'm very anti-gun, and a gun is a machine designed to end human life. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. So there's no equation where you're going to put a gun into that equation and it's going to make things better. You know, I would say, I mean, even with the police, you know, the invention of the taser, I think, is a pretty amazing thing, and it has saved lots and lots of lives.
In spite of its abuses.
Yeah, but there are ways around.
But it's better to be abused with a taser than a 9mm.
Than a gun, yeah. So there are ways around killing people, but so to say, oh, we're going to make hollow point bullets. Okay, a hollow point bullet. Why? You don't need that for target practice. What is that for? It's to spread so that it causes as much damage to a human being as possible.
It's the same as the nicotine principle.
It's not even used for deer.
It's the same as the nicotine principle, and it is. People use it's. So I come from the West, and I actually come from gun culture families. I don't own any guns. I used to hunt, and I used to be a part of the pro-Second Amendment movement before I was a Christian. And I grew up in a home that was very pro-gun. And I was raised around guns, and I enjoyed them as fun things to do. I also, where I come from out west, you know, when you're hunting deer, when you're hunting mule deer, you're shooting several 100-yard shots. And so how much is, you know, what's the handful of 1,000 people that actually do that in America? But nonetheless, if you're one of those people, the idea of having very high-powered ammunition and very long-range rifles is how they put food on their table. I think though that we should probably table. I'm more interested in economics for this
Yeah.
because we can do a whole
Yeah.
episode on guns and violence. But the economic questions are what are really fascinating in regards to this, is because how we evaluate the morality of industry, of of production and consumption is a pretty tricky thing.
Right. I mean, my daughter is a vegetarian.
Mm-hmm.
She's a vegetarian because she loves animals,
Uh-huh.
and cows make her smile, and she just it makes her cry to think about the fact that they're killing each other. And then she saw some YouTube videos about how the industrial meat farming happens, and that just blew her mind, and she's just horrified. But I tell her, "Do you like your iPhone? Because you can't have one without the other."
Yeah.
I mean, they used to be that we all were farmers,
Mm-hmm.
and we all grew our own food, and we took care of our own cows, and we slaughtered our own cows in a humane a way as we possibly could, and we ate them, and it was just part of life. It was accepting. And then we all moved to the city, and our jobs became fragmented, and you started working on microchips, and you started working on bulletproof glass, and you started working on wires, and then someone needs to make food.
Mm-hmm.
And there's millions of people in the city, and the only way that you can make millions and millions of pounds of beef is to consolidate. I mean, it's very difficult. So because there's a 2% of the country is farmers, it allows 98% of the country to make iPhones and to do other things like that. So the solution obviously is live off the grid, throw your iPhone away, grow your own food, don't buy anything, don't use money at all. And why don't we do that? That's the question. Morally, if that's what we should do. Why do I have this iPad is ridiculously expensive. This watch is like $400. It's ridiculous. I don't need that, and I know for a fact that there's starving people all over the world. Shouldn't I sell this and send the money to them? I mean, shouldn't I figure it out? It's like, at what point is it too much? People say, well, $100 billion is too much money for one person to have. Jeff Bezos shouldn't have that much money. It's too much of a percentage of the world's income. And I do agree with that. But at what point do you make enough money so that people now say, you can't have that? That's too much. Where is that line? Because honestly, $5 is too much. Because right now, for $5, somebody's life could be saved, and we are knowingly allowing that to happen.
What have you ever done the World Economic Index?
No.
There's a website where you can put in your annual income, and it will scale you in the world.
Yeah.
And brother,
we're all 1%ers.
We're all 1%ers.
Oh, for sure. No, I definitely am aware of that.
It's I struggle with those things quite a bit.
Yeah.
I don't know what
Jesus, the vow of poverty, right? Isn't that part of his thing? I mean,
so
a vow of poverty is I am not going to hoard. I'm not going to keep what I don't need.
Mm-hmm.
And instead I'm going to help my fellow man.
He lives as an example. Jesus, somebody comes to him one time and he says, hey, I want to follow you. And he says, you want to follow me? I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight. He says, the foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man doesn't know where he's going to lay his head. Is that, you want to follow me? Another guy comes to him. This is a famous story of the rich young ruler, and he says, hey, Jesus, I want to go to heaven. And Jesus says, well, you know the law. And he's, do the law. And he says, I've done all that since I was young. And he says, there's only one thing you're lacking. Sell that you have and give to the poor, and come and follow me. And this radical renunciation is a tenet of Christianity. It's often a neglected tenet, and it's one of those things, and I think this is where the real Jesus is. And forget Christendom, forget all the huff and the puff and the history and the temples and the cathedrals. The real Jesus is at this place where you don't ever get to really understand him or dismiss him, where you always have to wrestle with, what does he really mean? How deeply is that supposed to cut at me? What would he actually say about where I'm at?
Right. I mean, I think we know what he means. And I think that if everyone lived a Christ-like life, the world would be perfect. It would be perfect. But I'm aware that I'm not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I have this watch, and I'm going to have it tomorrow, And I struggle because I'm not a perfectly moral person, and that's an example.
Mm-hmm.
And this has nothing to do with religion. I mean, this has to do with economics. There are people starving to death. There's homeless people on the street. There was the longest time I didn't give homeless people money at all, because I was like, I don't want to feed into this, right? I don't want to give the money to allow that to be a thing, that, you can make money, you can survive by just doing nothing, right? And I was like, if you don't give the money, then they're going to have to figure out something else. But now I give money whenever I possibly can. I just feel like, wow, this is a person who, I don't know their story.
Yeah.
I don't know how they got to where they are.
Yeah.
And, one day I might be where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I can certainly spare this $5. So I try to do that. It doesn't make me feel much better. I mean, these are tough things. I mean, we can try our best to not be outwardly evil. I mean, that's something. Lee Iacocca was outwardly evil. I mean, there's no talking out of this one. There's no angle at which that's okay. To me, I think one of the worst. There's two sort of maxims in this American culture that I think are the ruination of us. One is, it's just business.
Like it's a special category.
It's
not
just business.
Subject
I kicked you in the face,
morality.
but it's just business.
It's not personal. It's business.
Right. It's just business means I can do whatever I want. It means it's just business. We decided it cost more to recall the cars than to pay off the insurance claims. It's just business. I mean, it's a bottom line. We're looking for our, we're watching out for our shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
It's business. No, it isn't just business. It's people's lives. Okay? It's just business is the dumbest excuse ever, and it's the most used. I mean, it's just that it's totally fine to do this because of money is involved.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one is, we'll talk another time, it's all's fair in love and war. No, it isn't. It isn't.
Nothing's fair.
You can be good.
Yeah.
You can be a good person.
Uh-huh.
So I wrote a few notes here. One of them is, what would you say God's idea is of wealth distribution? And that plays a little bit into what we were talking about. Shouldn't we all just take a vow of poverty?
Yeah.
Shouldn't we distribute the wealth in such a way? I mean, we all want Jeff Bezos to give 90% of his money to the poor, but why don't I give 90% of my money to the poor? I could live with 10%.
Yeah. It's so I think that's a great question. One of the things that I look at is that there was, if you look at the Old Testament among the organization and society structured in the Old Testament is intended to be a genuine theocracy. It was really supposed to be a nation run by God. That was the intention of the Mosaic Law and what God was doing in Israel. And when you look at how he set up society, it's very interesting, because here's the problem before we get to that analogy. The problem is you have to weigh things like that avarice, that monstrous greed on the one hand, with some real statistics about technological improvement, scientific improvement, health improvement. And it is very true, I think, to say that even the world's poor are better today than they were 100 years ago. There has been an economic tide that's risen all boats. So we can't ignore that. It's
right.
It's not unconnected to the discussion. And how much do we have to put up with the avarice and greed in order to have technological improvements in the things that are happening in the world? And who could know? So those are the tensions that we have, and it's why I end up at the end of my analyses becoming this kind of reluctant capitalist. Like, I'm uncomfortable with a lot of things about it, but I'm uncomfortable with the potential alternatives. So when I go back to the Old Testament again and I look at how did God set up an economy, for instance, that's a very intriguing idea. What kind of economy would God set up? There is two things. There is a system of private property ownership, but it is not unmitigated private property ownership. So it's a controlled private property. So what God did was so there were certain laws. If you had a field, you can't, okay, you're going to thresh your field, your wheat field. There's some laws that apply as a farmer, some Jewish laws. You can't muzzle your ox. He gets to eat while he works. God cares even about that animal working in the field. You can't control the animal. He's doing the work. He gets to eat the food of his work. So even the animals are cared for. The land is cared for. You were supposed to rest your field every 7 years. So the earth itself, environmental concerns were built into God's economic structures. You could not harvest the corners of your field. So you imagine you're taking your implements across the field, and instead of going corner to corner and corner to corner like we do, you would make a circle. And that corner of the field was left for the poor. That was a place for whoever lived in that area to know there was some provision for them. There's a social safety net, even in the agronomy of Israel, for people who couldn't care for themselves, for widows, for the dispossessed.
I mean, you can certainly apply that to today's politics. I mean, I consider myself a socialist. I've lived in France and I've lived in America. I've lived places, in France, which isn't a perfect society. I mean, there's no such thing. But in France, the government, the people decided what do we want our citizens to be, and they decided they want their citizens to be educated and healthy. So the social floor is you're educated and healthy. Education's free through college. It's free because we want you to be educated, and healthcare is free because we want you to be healthy. And they say, "Oh, it's
on the
not
assumption
really...
that you're more productive if you're educated and healthy."
Exactly, and they're like, "Oh, it's." People say, "Well, it's not really free. You pay 50% of your income or 60% of your income." Me, personally, right now, I spend 45% of my income towards healthcare and taxes.
It's a lot.
And 401k and other stuff like that, which I could not do. But I have a family of 5, and I pay $1,700 a month for healthcare. And if I go to the emergency room, it's $500. And if I get medication, it's $50 a bottle. I mean, it's so crazy that to talk of tweaking it is just outrageous. We need to just completely, destroy the whole thing. But we'll get into politics another time. But the point is that the poor eat the corners is a sort of a social floor. It's like we care about disabled people and poor people and old people and people who are unable to work for whatever reason. So I love the idea of toying with different ways of making that happen. Socialism is one, but universal income and other things. I mean, my big problem is that we don't try anything. We're like, oh yeah, it sucks that there's a mass shooting every couple of days and children get shot in schools, and that just sucks, but we don't try anything. I mean, let's try no guns. Let's try no laws whatsoever, and everybody can have guns. I mean, let's just try stuff.
Well, we do try
things. Just
things.
Complain.
We do try things, but maybe we don't try enough. Like, Clinton had the assault weapons ban during the late 90s. I remember that well.
Yeah, we try things like little incremental, like little shaving off. It's like, but we don't. We haven't tried.
It's because we're so big. It's the Google phenomenon. You can say, as America, we want to do no evil, or we want to take care of the poor. But it's so big with so many moving parts, and maybe the wave of the future is to turn the corner away from globalism and start. I think there was a food movement about local food for a while, but maybe we need to start thinking about everything in local communities.
I read an article that said that that people moved from the suburbs into the cities. It became hip to do that, right?
Yeah.
And now the cities are so expensive that they can't stay there. But the suburbs are so expensive that they can't stay there either.
Yeah.
So they're making little communities that are sort of around a central square where there's like a bunch of shops and things that you can do, but you can also live there. And and I was explaining this article that I read to Sarah, and Sarah's like, "You mean like a town?" I'm like, yeah, a village. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I've always said this. I'm a shy introvert, and I say I don't like people. That's not really true. Like, I love a person, and I love little groups of people, and I love going over to your house. I love family, and I love little groups, but I don't like big groups of people. I like a person. I don't like people. And in the way that we maybe stop Google from happening, or the huge government, is maybe these little villages is how we live, and then the little villages decide how they want to live.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to have guns in houses where your children play, then maybe you go to the village that doesn't do that. And they're similar enough that it's okay, and they're close enough so that it's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because when you think about it, you try to have a meeting with 20 people, and there's a lot of chaos. And there's hundreds of thousands of people who live in cities, and then millions of people, and then there's hundreds of millions of people, and then you've got a country. Like, do you know culturally how different Maine is from
Florida, South Florida,
Alabama?
Yeah,
I mean, it's just it's a different language practically.
So I think that I'm hopeful that that we can actually reproduce that, and even in urban environments. I mean, Boston used to be a city of neighborhoods. There was a lot of problems with that. They were ethnically exclusionary and all kinds of things that were problems. But at least if you lived in the North End, all the nonas sticking their heads out the window were watching all the children and knew who was who and what was going on. And that sense of community, and that's how we migrated towards urban areas with the intention of community. And we've kept our own senses of community for those reasons, so that there's some kind of cohesion, there's some kind of, I'm not adrift in this big sea of humanity and concrete all on my own, but I have a people and a place and a story and a purpose. And if you put those things in the hands of a group of people, I don't care who they are, if you give them belonging and purpose and community and relationships that care for them, that's what creates healthy humanity. And regardless of the superstructures that we happen to live in and around, we can do that all the time. And so the more that we can push towards some kind of intentionality with the people around us, some kind of commonality and purpose, the better off, I think, the more likely we are to find solutions to all these things.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually filming this right now in the living room of the co-housing community where I live. I live in an actual co-housing community, and the idea was that people wanted to know their own neighbors, so everybody has their own apartment with kitchen, bathroom, and living room and all that stuff. Some of them are one bedrooms, and some of them are efficiencies, and some of them are 3-story townhouses. But we all share this really big common space. There's a living room with a piano, and there's a dining room, and a kids' room, and libraries, and all that stuff. And we eat together as a community a few nights a week, and all the kids play at each other's houses, and nobody really locks their doors. And I mean, it's kind of like living in the 50s, hi, neighbor. And it's been amazing.
Right here in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Yeah, in the middle of the city. So it's been amazing for our children to grow up in this way, because as you said, everybody poking their heads out of the window. Yeah. Everybody knows who my children are. Yeah. Everybody knows that they're safe or that they're not. And the children enjoy it up to a certain point. When you turn 13, you don't want these old people knowing your business. So the children tend to disappear at a certain age. But yeah, it's been really cool living and raising children in this way. I mean, I lived in Boston in the Fenway for 10 years, and I did not know a single neighbor, not one person. I did not know the name of the lady across the hall from me. I mean, I'm also not I'm not a person that was going to spark conversation, but still, that's a little bit weird. 10 years and I knew not one person. It's just, and that's how it is.
It gets to a much bigger question of why we collectivize. I think so. We all kind of have a running assumption that that's how human society was structured, in these little, in your clan or your village or whatever. And the appeal to collectivize is probably innately human, and what that produces, just like our hunger for calories makes us fat. Like, now that we have abundance,
right,
that's what causes obesity, because our bodies are conditioned to seek calories, and especially sweet calories.
right.
So in order to deal with that, we have to recognize that tendency and trait and say, well, I'm not going to do what I'm naturally inclined to do. And I think the zeal for community and collectivization is kind of like that. What you realize, if you're a little village, is that if you pull another village in, and so there's got to be some kind of compromise. Like, maybe we don't have bows and arrows in our houses, but if we have another village here, we're more insulated from the Huns that may come, and so we're going to have bows and arrows, and we're going to be two villages, and we make that compromise. And all this happens for collective bargaining, for increased production, for commodities of scale, markets of scale in consumption. All these things happen to cause us to push into bigger and bigger sets of people. And there's probably some good reason for that, but just like the hunger for calories and sweet, to modify that and to moderate it and to recognize that left unchecked is going to lead us into bad places. So how do we put some checks and balances on those tendencies? How do we put some checks and balances on our nationalism, on our consumerism, on our competition?
Well, I mean, when I look at the Bible, right, when I look at the teachings of Christ, a person who I don't believe is the Son of God, but the words are great.
Yeah.
It's like, if you lived that way, that would be great. When I read the Constitution of the United States, I'm like, man, there's some smart people that got together and decided, how can we have a utopia? And they wrote this thing, and it's amazing. It's so great if we followed those principles.
Well, the devil's in the details, right?
If we followed the principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence, this would be a perfect society. But it's just not that possible. And I'm wondering, like with the Google thing, what's the threshold? A company has 15 people. Can they not be evil? 20, 100, 200? You have a bakery. And you bake the bread, you sell the bread, you market it, you do everything, and then it becomes popular, and you realize, I can't do this, I need somebody else. So you hire another baker, and then it gets so big that now you have another store, and then it gets so big you have 3 stores, and then you don't know anything about managing 3 stores, and it's getting difficult, so you have to hire a manager. Now you're hiring somebody who's not a baker, who has no idea about anything about customer service. That's not what he does. He's just about management. So he says, okay, here's where you need to make money. He has no idea that this is going to make people upset. You know what I mean? It's like you get so big that you can't help but have people making decisions that don't align with why you do what you do.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that threshold is, and how we can dial that back.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So, and I guess a sort of a final note is it good enough to be better? Right? To say that tomorrow I'm going to be better. Tomorrow I'm going to give away a shirt. Tomorrow I'm not going to go to the mall and look at retail things. To strive to be better. Because I know that the best thing would be for me to sell all of my possessions and to live in the woods and to help people with every fiber of my muscle. But I'm not going to do that. And should I feel guilty that I don't do that, Or is it good enough to say I'm not going to buy a shirt that costs $15 because I just know that's not possible without some sort of slave labor along the way? Or is it okay to say I'm going to research, and I'm going to say Nike makes shoes in China, therefore it's got to be bad at some point, even if I don't know exactly what it, or is that fair to Nike? Is it not fair? Is it okay to just try to do better? Or is it shameful that we're not living in poverty?
I think it is I'm hopeful that it is meaningful to do better, to continue making decisions in favor of humanity, in favor of people instead of things, that we can, if we were conditioned to be responsive to the, the glossy ads that are supposed to give us meaning in our possessions, that we can recondition ourselves to think of people instead, to make incremental decisions that prioritize people and their well-being over possession and profit.
Right. I mean, treat others how you want to be treated is not a biblical thing. It's a moral thing. It's been around forever. And, that's, as a business, you get to decide. You get to decide what kind of business you want to be. How quickly do I answer the phone? How nice am I going to be to this customer? And if you asked yourself, how would I want to be treated, that would answer so many questions. Well, it's such an easy thing.
That's exactly it. And I think that one of the things that I was convicted about, Eric and I both, a long time ago, was that we were much more poor when we were young. I don't know how we rate now. We do much better now. I have a business and we have a large home, and so things work. I worry much less about paying my bills than I ever did when I was very young, but I still worry about it from time to time. But the thing is, especially what's fascinating to me is that when they do sociological research, we tend to find that people of lower economic strata are more generous and more giving, which is interesting to me.
Yeah.
But it's also the case that coming from the bottom of the economic strata in the particular environment that you're in, we really get hyped up about getting a good deal. And so where's the sales? How can we save some money? What can we do to get the most out of what we have? And we ran our family that way when we were young. We were pretty miserly and always trying to make sure we got a good deal. And at some point, we began to think, well, what does it mean to give a good deal? What does it mean to benefit, not just to be the beneficiary of something, but to be the benefactor, to make sure that people that interact with me are getting a good deal? And that kind of puts you on both sides of the economic equation.
I really like that. Yeah. That idea. How can I give a good deal?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's beautiful. All right.
Okay.
Want to end it there?
Let's end it there.
All right. Love you.
Love you too.